I was 23, the night a king's voice broke open in front of me. I have told almost no one this. My wife knows a little. My brother knows less. For most of my life I kept it folded up small and put it somewhere at the back of me, the way you keep an old photograph you can't look at and can't throw away. But I'm older now, and there are some things a man should say out loud before he forgets the exact weight of them. So let me take you back. It was a winter night, late. The kind of cold that gets into the stone and stays there, so the whole palace seems to hum with it. I had been a guardsman for not quite a year. 11 months, if you want the truth, and most of those 11 months I had spent standing perfectly still while my feet went numb, and the tourists took photographs of me as if I were a statue someone had dressed up for a joke. You learn that early. You are not a person to them. You are a thing to be looked at. A red coat and a tall black cap and a face that does not move. Children waved at me. Men tried to make me laugh. A girl once leaned in so close I could smell her perfume and whispered something that would have got her arm twisted off if a sergeant had heard it. I didn't blink. That was the whole point. You don't blink. The first thing they teach you, and I mean the very first thing, before they teach you how to march or how to hold the rifle or any of it, is this. Whatever happens in front of you, you are not part of it. You are the wall. You are the still point. The world can fall down around your ears and your job is to stand there and let it fall and not move a single muscle in your face. I used to think that was the easy part, standing still. How hard can it be to do nothing? That night taught me how hard. I should tell you about the place, so you can see it the way I saw it. It wasn't a palace out of a fairy tale. People imagine gold everywhere, chandeliers the size of carriages, that sort of thing. There was some of that in the rooms the public never saw, but mostly it was old. Old in the way a cathedral is old. Long corridors that smelled of beeswax and cold air, and faintly of the flowers they changed every other day. The carpets ran red down the center of the halls, and the edges were worn pale where 100 years of feet had walked them. The portraits on the walls were all dead men looking down at you like they knew something you didn't. At night the place changed. The tourists were long gone. The staff thinned out to almost nothing. The big public rooms were locked and dark, and what was left was this enormous, breathing quiet, with the wind pushing at the tall windows and the radiators ticking somewhere and your own footsteps sounding far too loud no matter how softly you set them down. I had been moved to night duty that week. I won't pretend I liked it. The days were tedious, but the nights were strange. In the daytime there were people, noise, the changing of the guard, something to fix your eyes on. At night there was just you and the dark and the long thoughts you'd rather not have. That particular night, I had been posted somewhere I had never stood before. Usually a man my rank stood outside at the gate or in one of the courtyards, freezing and ignored. But there had been some reshuffling, a senior man taken ill, another sent home for a family matter, and the sergeant ran his eye down the list, and his finger stopped on me. "Wicker," he said, "inside tonight, East Landing." I didn't even know where the East Landing was. I had to be walked to it. It was upstairs, the private side of the house where the family lived, where the public never came and where men like me almost never went. Up a staircase with a banister so smooth and dark it looked wet. Along a corridor narrower than the grand ones below, lined with smaller paintings, not the great state portraits but little things, watercolors, a child's drawing in a frame, a photograph or two, family things, human things. It felt wrong to be standing there if I'm honest. Like I'd walked into someone's home with my boots on. The man walking me up said very little. He showed me my spot, a recess by a window halfway along where a guardsman could stand without being in anybody's way. He pointed at a door at the far end of the corridor and said, "Lo, His Majesty's private apartments. You don't go past this window. You don't look down that end. If anyone comes through, you do what you always do. You stand. Understood?" "Understood," I said. "Long night," he said, and he was gone, his footsteps fatting down the stair, and then there was just me. Let me tell you a little about the king, because you'll want to know. I had seen him perhaps 4 times before that night and never close. A figure at a distance in a car on a balcony, surrounded always by other men. He was not a young man. There was gray through his hair and a tiredness in him that the photographs never quite caught. The newspapers liked to call him cold, stern, a man of duty and not much warmth. You heard the same things in the corridors, that he was difficult, that he had a temper he kept locked up tight, that the staff stepped careful around him. But you also heard other things, quieter things, from the older men who'd served a long time, that he never forgot a name, that when one of the kitchen boys lost his mother, the king had sent a note in his own hand, that he sat up late, alone, more nights than not. There had been a sadness around the house for a long while. I had felt it even as a new man who knew nothing. It was in the way people spoke. Lowered, careful. The king had lost his son. Not recently, it had been a year or more, but grief like that doesn't keep a calendar. The prince had died abroad, far away, after years of not speaking to his father. They had fallen out, the two of them, badly, the way fathers and sons can. Words had been said that couldn't be taken back. And then the chance to take them back was gone, all at once, with a telephone call in the middle of the night. I knew this the way servants know things, half rumor, half truth, pieced together from things overheard. I didn't know the half of it. I would before the night was out. There was a woman, too. I should tell you about her now, though that night I didn't know her name. She came up the stairs not long after I'd been posted. A handsome woman, somewhere past 50, silver in her dark hair, dressed in the quiet, expensive way that people in that house dressed. She carried herself like she belonged there, like she'd belonged there for years. She didn't so much as glance at me. Why would she? And she walked the length of the corridor and knocked at the far door, the one I'd been told not to look at, and was let inside. I learned later who she was, Lady Helena Marsh. She had been close to the family for 30 years, closest of all to the late Queen, the king's wife, who had died when the children were still young. After the Queen was gone, it was Lady Helena who stayed, a friend, an advisor, the one person the king trusted without thinking about it, the way you trust your own hand. She was the one, you see, but I'm getting ahead of myself. For a long while, nothing happened. That's the thing about that kind of duty. Most of it is nothing. You stand. The window beside me had frost feathering up from the corners, and beyond the glass I could see the courtyard far below, white under a bit of moon, the bare trees black against the snow. A clock somewhere struck 11, then 1/2 past. My feet began their slow journey into numbness, and I shifted my weight an inch at a time, the way you learn to, so nobody could ever say you moved. I let my mind wander, which you're not supposed to do, but everybody does. I thought about home, about my mother's kitchen and the smell of it, about a girl I'd been writing to, about whether I'd chosen the right life, standing in dead men's corridors in the middle of the night while the rest of the world slept warm in its bed. I thought, I remember, that nothing ever happens here, that I would do this for years and have nothing to show for it but cold feet and a straight back. I have laughed at that thought many times since, because at some point, close to midnight it must have been, I began to hear voices. They were faint at first, just the suggestion of them coming from the far door, a man's voice and a woman's, the way you hear conversation through a wall, all rhythm and no words. I didn't pay it much mind. People talked. It was none of my business. That was the whole shape of my job, none of it was my business. But the rhythm changed. You know how a voice changes when something's gone wrong, even if you can't hear the words. It gets a different shape to it. Harder, faster. The pauses get sharper. The man's voice came up first, just for a second, then dropped again, like a man trying to hold himself in. The woman's voice answered, low and steady, and then his came up once more, and this time it didn't drop back down so quickly. I kept my eyes front, I kept my face still. I told myself it was nothing, a disagreement. People argue. Kings argue, I supposed, same as anyone. But the cold corridor seemed to go very quiet around the sound, the way a room goes quiet when two people start fighting at a party and everyone else pretends not to hear. The clock ticked. The wind pressed at the glass. And down at the far end, behind that door I'd been told not to look at, a man's voice was rising and rising, and I stood there 20 steps away with my heart starting to go faster than it had any right to, telling myself, over and over, you are the wall, you do not move. You are not part of this. I heard him say one word clearly. Just one, that first time. I couldn't tell you the sentence around it, but the word came through the door sharp as a struck bell. How? That was all. How? Like a man who has been hit and hasn't felt the pain yet, only the shock of being hit. Then the woman's voice again, lower, pleading now. I thought there was a pleading shape to it and his cutting across it, and I caught a few more words this time, broken pieces of them. All this time. And you let me. And something I lost in the thickness of the door. I want you to understand what that does to you. To stand close enough to hear a man's heart breaking and far enough that you can't make out the words. You become an instrument of pure listening. Every other sense narrows. The cold goes away. The numbness in your feet goes away. There is only the door and the voices and the terrible curiosity that you are ashamed of even as you feel it. I gripped the rifle a little tighter, not to use it, just to hold on to something. Here is the part I have thought about most in all the years since. There came a moment, and it couldn't have been more than a few minutes into it, though it felt much longer, when I understood that I was hearing something no one was ever meant to hear. This was not a king being kingly. This was not the cold, stern man from the newspapers. This was a man in a room with the one person in the world he had trusted, and that person had done something to him, and he was coming apart at the seams. And I, a boy from a small town who had been a guardsman for 11 months, was the only witness. I had a choice in that moment. I want to be honest about it. The choice wasn't whether to do something. There was nothing to do, no one in danger, no order to follow, no enemy at the gate. The choice was smaller and harder than that. The choice was whether to stay the man I had been trained to be. Because every part of me wanted to do something, to move, to step away down the corridor where I couldn't hear, to cough, to make a sound, to let them know there was a stranger close by so they'd lower their voices and the king could have his grief in private the way he deserved. It felt indecent to stand there. It felt like spying, even though I'd been put there and told to stay. But that's not the job. The job is to be the wall. The wall doesn't cough to spare anyone's feelings. The wall doesn't move because the thing it's hearing is unbearable. The wall stands, and it lets the unbearable thing happen in front of it, and it keeps its face like stone, because the moment a wall flinches it stops being a wall and becomes just another frightened person in the room. So I stood. God help me, I stood and I listened, and I kept my eyes on the frost on the window across from me, and I did not move. The voices kept on, worse now. The woman, Lady Helena, though I still didn't know it, had stopped sounding steady. There was a catch in her voice, the catch of someone trying not to cry while they explain themselves, which is the worst sound a grown person makes. And under it, behind it, the king's voice had dropped into something low and flat and terrible, not shouting anymore, quieter than shouting. The kind of quiet that's much worse than shouting, the kind you only reach when the anger has burned all the way down to the bone, and what's left underneath is just hurt. I caught a whole sentence then, the first one I heard clean from start to finish. It came through a gap in the storm in that flat, low voice, and it has never once left me. He wrote to me, the king said. All that time he wrote to me, and you let me believe he never did. I didn't understand it, not fully, not then, but I understood enough. A son who wrote, a father who never knew, and a woman standing between them who'd made sure of it. There was no answer to that, or if there was, she didn't have it because the silence that followed went on, longer than the voices had, and somehow it was the silence that frightened me most. The voices I could bear. They were a storm and storms pass, but that silence had something gathering in it. I felt it the way an animal feels weather coming. I stood in my recess by the cold window with the dead men watching from the walls, and I waited, and I knew the way you know a glass is going to fall before it falls, that the silence was about to break, and that when it broke, it would not break quietly. I'll tell you what broke it, but I think I'll let you sit with that quiet a moment, the way I had to. Because what came next was the thing I'd been put there to witness without knowing it, and it's where this story really begins. The silence broke the way I knew it would, with glass. It came all at once, a crash so sudden and so loud in that quiet corridor that my whole body jolted before my mind could stop it. Not a small sound, a big one. The sound of something heavy thrown hard against a wall and bursting apart, and then a long, bright scatter as the pieces went everywhere across a stone floor. A vase. I learned that later, too. A tall blue and white thing that had stood in the king's apartments longer than I'd been alive. A gift to his grandfather from some foreign court. The kind of object that's worth more than a house and means nothing at all next to the thing that broke it. I jolted. I'll admit that. A man would have to be made of wood not to. My shoulders came up an inch and the air went out of me. For half a second, half a heartbeat, I was just a frightened boy in a cold corridor who'd heard something smash in the dark. And then the training took hold of me again. The way a hand takes hold of the back of your collar and pulled me straight. You are the wall, you do not move. I set my shoulders back down. I fixed my eyes on the frost on the window. I made my face into stone. My heart was going like a hammer, and there was a fine tremble running down my arms into my hands where they held the rifle, but you couldn't have seen it. I made sure you couldn't have seen it. If the king himself had walked out at that moment and looked me dead in the eye, he would have seen nothing but a guardsman at his post, calm as a frozen pond. Inside, I was not calm. Inside, I was 23 years old and terrified, and I wanted my mother. After the crash, his voice came, and now it wasn't low and flat anymore. Now it was loud. Now the storm had its full weight behind it, and the door might as well have been paper for all the good it did at keeping the words in. Don't, he said. Don't you dare tell me it was kindness. Don't you dare stand in this room and tell me you did it to spare me. Lady Helena's voice answered, and it was breaking now, all the steadiness gone. Aldous, please. He was my son. It cracked on the last word. I'd never heard a grown man's voice do that, not like that, not a man like him. It went up and split and came down again, and underneath it was something raw that I had no name for then and a name for now. It was grief, pure grief, with the lid torn off it. He was my son and he was dying, the king said, and he wrote to me and you took the letters. The corridor seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind at the window had gone still. There was only that voice pouring out of the room and me standing there with no choice but to catch every word of it. I have replayed it, he said. Every day for a year I have replayed those last years and asked myself why he never reached out, why my own boy would let himself go like that and never once try to mend it. I told myself he hated me. I have lain awake telling myself my son died hating me. A sound then, a terrible dragging breath. And the whole time, the letters were in your hands. He was reaching across the whole world to me and your hands were in the way. I was trying to protect you. From my own son. From being hurt again. Aldous, the things he said to you, the way he left, I watched it nearly destroy you. When the first letter came I thought, I cannot let him do that to you twice. I thought. You thought, his voice dropped. And that was worse, that drop, because I'd learned by then that the quiet was where the deepest cuts were. You thought. You decided. You sat in your house and you read my son's words to me and you decided I was not strong enough to hear them. You decided for me. For 30 years I have let you decide things, Helena, small things, kind things, and I was grateful for it. And you took that, you took my gratitude and you used it to keep my dying boy away from me. That is not. How many, he said, how many letters? Silence. How many, Helena? A long pause, and then so quiet I almost missed it through the door. 11. I will never forget that number. 11. The same number of months I'd been a guardsman. I remember thinking that stupidly in the middle of everything, 11 months, 11 letters, as if the world were trying to tell me something I was too young to understand. There was a sound then that I have only heard a few times in my life and hope never to hear again. The sound of a man who has held himself together for a very long time, in front of crowds and cameras and the whole watching world, finally letting go where he thinks no one can see. He wept. Not gently, not the way they show it in films, a single tear, a brave face. He wept the way you weep when the dam goes, great heaving sounds, ugly and helpless, a king crying like a child for a child of his own, and you could hear him trying to stop and not being able to. You could hear him fighting it and losing. And I stood in the corridor and listened to a king weep, and I did not move. I want to tell you what that was like because I don't think there's any way to truly know it unless you've stood where I stood. It is one thing to keep still when nothing is happening. It is another thing entirely to keep still when every nerve in your body is screaming at you to do something, anything, to make the unbearable sound stop. To go to the man. To knock. To call for someone. To at the very least, look away, give him the privacy of not being witnessed. I did none of it. I couldn't. My orders, my training, the whole shape of what I was, they all said the same thing, and it was the cruelest and the kindest instruction at once. Stand. Be the wall. Let him believe he is alone, because the only mercy you can give him is to stay so perfectly still that you don't exist. So that's the gift I gave the king that night. I made myself not exist. I let the tears come down my own face. I could do that much in the dark with my eyes front and my chin up, the salt running quiet down into my collar, and I gave no other sign that I was a living man at all. I let him grieve as if there were no one in the world to hear it. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. It was the only thing I had to give him, and I have never been more certain before or since that I did the right thing by doing nothing at all. It went on a long time. Grief has no clock. After a while the weeping eased the way a storm eases, not all at once but in pulls, the gaps between getting longer. And in those gaps I heard Lady Helena. She wasn't defending herself anymore, that was over. Now she was just saying his name over and over, soft, the way you gentle a frightened horse. Aldous, Aldous, I'm so sorry. Aldous, I'm so sorry. And there was no answer to it. Some sorries come too late to be caught. They just fall into the empty air between two people and lie there. Then the king said something I had to strain to hear, and it was the line I have carried longest of all, longer even than "he was my son," because there's a kind of pain in it that the loud lines didn't have. She lied to me, he said, not to her, past her, to the room, to the air, to himself, as if he were trying out the shape of it, testing whether it could possibly be true. The one person I never thought to doubt. A long, shaking breath. Everyone lies to a king, I know that. I learned that before I was a grown man. The whole world bows and smiles and lies, and you build yourself a few small rooms where the lying isn't allowed, a few people you let all the way in. His voice was almost wondering now, almost calm, and it was the most frightening calm I ever heard. And you were one of those rooms, Helena. You were one of the few, and it wasn't true. None of it was a place I could put my feet down. She lied to me. The one I trusted last of all. I heard her crying then, properly crying, and I heard nothing from him at all, and somehow his silence was louder than her tears. The door opened. I hadn't expected it. After everything, I'd half forgotten the door was a door, that it could open and let the storm out into my corridor. But it opened, and the light from the room fell across the worn red carpet in a long yellow bar, and Lady Helena came out. I kept my eyes front. You learn to see a great deal without moving your eyes. It's a trick of the edges. You watch the world sideways. So I saw her without looking at her. She came out slowly, like a woman much older than she'd gone in. Her face was wrecked. Her hand was pressed to her mouth. She stopped just outside the door, and she stood there a moment with her back to the room as if she couldn't make herself take the next step away from it, as if leaving made it final. Then she turned to go, and she came down the corridor toward me. And here is the thing I have wondered about 10,000 times since. She passed within 3 feet of me, close enough that I heard her breathing, ragged and wet, close enough that if I'd reached out I could have touched her sleeve. And in the moment she passed, her eyes came up and found mine. She saw me. She saw that I was there. She understood in that one look that a guardsman had been standing 20 steps from that door for the whole of it. That a stranger, a boy in a red coat she'd walked straight past on the way in, never once thinking of him as a person who could hear, had heard all of it. Every word. The letters. The number. The weeping. The whole ruin of 30 years. I watched her understand it. I saw the horror of it go across her ruined face. And I saw her wait just for a second for me to react. To flinch. To show by some flicker that I had heard, that I was judging, that I was a witness who would carry this out of the palace and into the world. I gave her nothing. I kept my face stone. I kept my eyes front, looking at a point on the wall a yard above her head. I let her look as long as she wanted, and I did not so much as breathe wrong. As far as my face was concerned, I had heard nothing, seen nothing, been nowhere. There was no boy in the corridor. There was only a wall, and walls don't carry secrets out into the world. I watched the understanding change in her eyes. The horror eased just slightly. She saw what I was doing. She saw that I had made myself into nothing, and that nothing keeps nothing, and that whatever I'd heard would go into me and stay there. She gave me the smallest nod, so small you'd have missed it if you weren't looking sideways. Not thanks exactly. There was no thanks left in her that night. It was more like recognition. One person in the wreckage seeing another and acknowledging the kindness of being unseen. Then she was past me, and her footsteps went away down the corridor and down the stair, slower than they'd come, and the sound of them got smaller and smaller until the quiet swallowed them. And I was alone again, except I wasn't. Because the door was still open and the light was still falling across the carpet, and somewhere in that room, behind the wall I couldn't see past, the king was sitting alone among the pieces of a broken vase, and I knew it, and I had to keep standing there knowing it. I thought he might call out, for a footman, for someone to clear the glass, for anyone. I half braced for it, but no call came. The minutes went by and the open door just stayed open, and the light just stayed fallen across the carpet, and the most enormous quiet you can imagine settled over that end of the corridor. I could hear him in it, not weeping anymore, just breathing, slow now and heavy, the breathing of a man who has cried himself empty and doesn't have the strength yet to get up. Every now and then there was a small sound, a shift, the creak of a chair, once the unmistakable tiny chime of a piece of broken china being moved, as if he'd reached down and picked up a single shard and was turning it over in his fingers. I have thought about that shard a great deal. A king, alone, past midnight, sitting in the ruins of his own temper, turning a broken piece of something priceless over and over in his hands, because it was the only thing left in the room to hold. And 20 steps away, a boy who wasn't supposed to exist, standing guard over a grief he had no right to know about. Keeping it the way you keep a flame cupped in your hands against the wind, not because anyone would ever know if he let it go out, but because he knew. I want to be clear about something before I tell you how the night ended. I keep saying it was the hardest thing I ever did, the standing still. And it was. But it wasn't hard the way carrying a weight is hard, or the way the cold was hard. It was hard in a different way. It was hard because every minute that I stood there, the man behind that door became more real to me, more human, less of a king and more of a father. And the more human he became, the more my whole body wanted to cross the line I'd been told never to cross, the more it wanted to be a person to him instead of a wall. And I knew, even at 23, somehow I knew that the kindest thing, the only decent thing, was to refuse that want, to stay the wall, because a man in that state doesn't want a witness. He doesn't want comfort from a stranger in a uniform. What he wants, the only thing left that anyone can give him, is the dignity of believing he is suffering in private. So I gave it to him. Minute after minute, in the cold, with the door open and the light spilling out, I stood at my post, and I gave that broken man the gift of my own nothingness, and I would have stood there till dawn to keep giving it. I didn't know then that before the night was out, the king would do the one thing I'd never imagined. He was going to find out I was there. He came to the door slowly. I heard him before I saw him, the chair creaking as he got up, a long pause as if standing had cost him something, then his footsteps crossing the room. Not the brisk walk you saw in the newsreels. A heavy, uneven walk, the walk of a man who'd aged a decade in an hour. The light in the doorway shifted, and then he was there in the open door, with the broken china still scattered behind him across the floor. I kept my eyes front, but I saw him at the edges the way I'd seen Lady Helena, and I tell you if I'd passed him in the street I would not have known him for a king. His shirt was open at the collar. His face was gray and swollen, the eyes red-rimmed and raw, his hair pushed every which way where he'd had his hands in it. He looked like any man who just lost the thing that mattered most. He looked, more than anything, old and tired and entirely alone. He stood in the doorway and he breathed, and I waited for him to call down the corridor for a footman, for someone to come and clear the mess and put him to bed. That's what I expected. That's what should have happened. The wall stands, the master calls, the world rearranges itself. Instead, he turned his head. And he looked straight at me. I have replayed that moment more than any other. The instant the king's eyes found me in the recess by the window, and he understood, the same understanding I'd watched cross Lady Helena's face, but slower, heavier, because he had so much more to lose by it. He understood that I was there. That a guardsman had been standing 20 steps from that door for the whole of it. That every word, the letters, the number, the weeping, the worst hour of his life, had happened in front of a witness. That the privacy he'd believed he had, the privacy he'd let himself break down inside of, had never existed. There had been a man in the corridor the entire time. I braced for it, I won't pretend otherwise. In the half-second his eyes held mine, a dozen things went through me. He could have me dismissed. He could have me dismissed before sunrise, and worse, he could believe I'd carry it out, sell it, whisper it, that by morning the whole world would know the king had wept over hidden letters from his dead son. A man in his position, in his state, had every reason to look at me and see a threat, a leak, a liability in a red coat. I did the only thing I could do, the thing I'd been doing all night. I kept my face stone. I kept my eyes, now that he was looking at me, now that the front was right at him, fixed at that point above his head, the soldier's middle distance, the look that says I see nothing, I am nothing, I am not a man who heard anything at all. I stood as still as I have ever stood in my life. I let him look at me and find absolutely nothing to find. And I watched him understand that too. It took a moment. His eyes searched my face, really searched it, the way a drowning man searches for something to hold. He was looking for a reaction, for pity, for judgment, for the flicker of a person who'd heard a king brought low and was filing it away to tell. He was looking for the thing he had every right to be afraid of. He didn't find it. He found a wall. He found a young man who had clearly heard everything and was giving him, by the sheer stone of his stillness, the one thing left to give, the pretense that it had never happened at all. Something went out of his shoulders. Some terrible bracing tension I hadn't even known was there until it left him. And his face, God, his face. It did something I've never been able to describe properly. It softened, and it broke a little more, and it filled with something that wasn't quite gratitude, because gratitude is too small a word. It was the look of a man who has just discovered, at the very bottom of the worst night of his life, that the world has handed him one small, unexpected mercy. That the stranger who held his secret was going to hold it. That he was not, after all, completely undone. He didn't have to speak. By every rule of that house, he never should have. Kings don't explain themselves to guardsmen. Walls aren't addressed. But he spoke. He took a step toward me, just one, and he stopped. And in a voice that had nothing of the king in it, nothing of the man from the balcony, a voice worn down to the plain wood of a person, he said, "How long have you been standing there?" I broke my own rule to answer him. You have to, when the king asks you directly. The stillness gives way to the older duty of the answer. I kept my eyes front and I said quietly, "All evening, Your Majesty." He took that in. I saw him take it in, what it meant, what I'd heard, the whole weight of it landing. "All evening," he repeated. "Yes, Your Majesty." There was a long pause. The wind had come back to the window. The broken china glinted behind him in the lamplight. "And what did you hear?" he asked, not sharp, not testing, just tired and needing to know. I have thought about my answer for the rest of my life, and I have never once wished I'd said anything different. "Nothing, Your Majesty," I said. "I was at my post." I felt him look at me. I felt him understand exactly what I meant by it, that I had heard everything, and that everything I had heard was nothing, would always be nothing, would go into the ground with me as nothing. That a wall hears nothing because a wall is not a person, and I had chosen all evening long to be the wall. And the king of all that great house, the man the newspapers called cold, looked at a 23-year-old guardsman he had never met and would likely never see again, and he said, very simply, "Thank you." That was all. One word. The same word he'd flung at Lady Helena hours before, when he'd thrown her thanks back in her face, but this time it went the other way, from a king to a boy, and it was the realest thing I ever heard a man say. I have been thanked many times in my life for larger things. None of them ever weighed what that one word weighed. I said nothing. There was nothing a wall could say. I gave him the smallest motion of my eyes, not a nod. I couldn't break the line that far, but enough that he knew I'd received it. He stood a moment longer, and then he straightened. You could see him gathering himself, pulling the king back on like a coat over the man, getting ready to be the figure the morning would need him to be. He turned back toward his room. But at the door he paused, one hand on the frame, and without looking at me he said one more thing, so quietly it was almost to himself. "He was a good boy," he said. "My son, he was a good boy. I just want someone to have known that." And then he went in, and the door closed, and the bar of light across the carpet vanished, and I was alone in the dark corridor with the cold and the dead men on the walls, and the after silence of the worst and most human night of my life. I stood there until my relief came at 4. I cleared nothing up. The glass was someone else's job. I just stood, the way I'd been taught, the way I'd done all night, and I let the hours go by, and somewhere behind that door a king slept or didn't sleep, and his secret stayed exactly where I'd put it. I never told anyone, not for years, not the men in the barracks who'd have killed for that story, not the newspapers who'd have paid for it, not the friends who, drink in hand, asked me what the strangest thing I ever saw in that uniform was, and got some safe little tale about a fainting tourist or a fox in the courtyard instead. The king died a long time after that night. I was no longer in service by then. I'd left the guard, married my girl, made a quiet, ordinary life far from any palace. But I read about it in the paper, the way the whole country did, and I sat in my kitchen with the paper in my hands and I thought about the corridor, and the cold, and the bar of yellow light across the worn red carpet, and the sound of a man weeping for a son he'd been lied about, and the one word he gave me at the end of it. And I thought about the boy I'd been. 23, terrified, certain that nothing ever happened on that duty, certain I'd spend my years standing still and have nothing to show for it but cold feet and a straight back. I'd been so wrong about that. I'd had something to show for it all along. I'd just never been able to show it to anyone. People ask me sometimes, the few who know I served, what the job was really about. They think it's about the marching, the uniform, the never laughing, the postcard of it all. And I let them think that mostly. But it isn't that. It was never that. The job was about being trusted to stand somewhere you were never meant to see, and to carry what you saw there for the rest of your life, and to never, not once, let it weigh on the person you saw it happen to. The job was to be the wall a man could fall apart in front of and still believe himself alone. The job was a kindness that no one would ever thank you for, because the whole worth of it was that they'd never know you done it. He knew, that's the thing. For one moment at the bottom of the worst night of his life, the king knew exactly what I'd done by doing nothing, and he thanked me for it. And then we both let it become nothing again, the way it had to be. I am an old man now. I've outlived the king and Lady Helena and most of the men I served with. There's almost no one left who could even doubt this story, let alone confirm it. And I find that after all this time, I wanted to say it once, out loud. Not for the king, he's past needing it, and not for myself. For the boy he wrote to. The son. Prince of nowhere now, dead these many years. A good boy whose own father spent a year believing he died hatting him, when all along he'd been reaching across the whole world with 11 letters no one would let through. His father wanted someone to have known he was good. So now you know. A stranger in a red coat who stood 20 steps away in the cold and heard a king's heart break and kept it safe, and is telling you now only so that somewhere out there, the good of a boy nobody remembers gets said aloud one last time. That's the whole of it, that's what I carried. I never moved, and it was the proudest thing I ever did.